Welcome everyone. My name is Professor Douglas Bourne. I'm Professor of Development Education here at UCL. I'd like to welcome you to this UCL lunch hour lecture on the title of Opportunities and Challenges for Decolonising Research in Higher Education. Our speaker today is Dr. Simon Itan, who was one of my own doctoral students, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Simon to you. So Simon completed his PhD at Institute of Education on the topics of global citizenship, education, and internationalization as they apply to higher education context in Africa and the global south more widely, influencing theories from critical pedagogy, post-colonial and decolonial theories. Simon has been working with us on a postdoctoral research project on student activism, which is an international collaborative project involving a number of countries around Europe, looking particularly at what young people's engagement and activism. He was also the consultant on the UCL Cultures of Decolonisation research that I was chairing, which is part of the UCL Grand Challenge on Cultural Understanding. So before I begin, I just wanted to remind you of the sort of protocol for today. So Simon will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll ask you if you've got any questions or comments you have to use the Slido facility, which I think is made available to you. You'll be able to see that. So please use that as your way of entering any comments, and to use the event code of #decolonize if you wish to make any comments. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Simon, who will introduce his talk for you on opportunities and challenges for decolonising research in higher education. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Prof, for the introduction, and also just to thank the organizers for inviting me to present findings from our project. Just to reiterate part of the introduction Prof did. So I was research assistant for the Cultures of Decolonisation at UCL project. That commenced sometime 2021, 2022. And then my role was in collecting data, but also in drafting the final report for the project. After the report was published, I also collaborated with Prof to engage with EDI communities across UC to try to see how we could take up themes from the report in their activities. So today offers an opportunity to share findings from the project and to use that to try and discuss the opportunities and challenges for decolonizing research. So a brief background on the project. So it was designed by the UCL Grand Challenges of Cultural Understanding Working Group. And the rationale for the project's development was based on the fact that at the time, there were many discussions going on in universities across the UK, but also within UCL on decolonization. But most of those discussions were focused on teaching and learning, that is the curriculum, and less so on research. And so the project was designed to address that gap in terms of the research dimension of decolonization. Specifically, the project sought to assess the extent to which UCL's norms and practices support decolonizing research. In terms of methodology, our approach was open-ended as we sought to engage a wide audience across UCL and gain an in-depth perspective on the issues at UCL. And so in all, we had 46 researchers, 8 doctoral students, 12 professional staff participating in our interviews. Alongside, we delivered two different surveys, and that was responded by 9 academics and then 11 doctoral students. Besides that, we also reviewed academic literature on the topic, including project reports and the websites of decolonizing research projects within UCL, across UK, and then globally. So even before I get into the findings of the project, the organizers of the event informed me that some of the audience we have today may not have background knowledge on the issues around decolonization and its related discussions. And so it will be in order for me to try and then throw some light on the foundational concepts and then the rationale behind decolonization in universities. First of all, it is important to note that decolonization as a construct or as a concept has a strong connection to the colonial struggles and the political decolonization of formerly colonized territories. That happened sometime mid 20th century. And so usually the discussions around decolonization have as their reference point this historical epoch. But then in the context of higher education, the concepts that are often used relating to discussions on decolonization are coloniality, post-coloniality, the anti-colonial, and then decoloniality. A helpful way to understand coloniality is to see it as the problematic in discussions of decolonization, to the extent that higher education that we have today is marked by a preponderance or a prevalence of racialized hierarchies and the dominance of Eurocentric knowledge and cultural systems, usually to the neglect of knowledge and cultural forms from the global south. And so the antidote for this coloniality is usually expressed in the language around post-coloniality, the anti-colonial, and then decoloniality. For these three terminologies, a common political goal in them is the resistance and defiance of colonial domination and then colonial subordination. But then decoloniality as a construct has a specific epistemological focus in the sense that it seeks to address the imbalances and hierarchies in the production and then the distribution of knowledge. And so that is why decolonization is particularly rampant and common in discussions across universities. So based on the preceding, the goal of decoloniality in higher education, I borrowed from the definition authored by Malcolm Tite, who says that the goal of decoloniality in higher education is to remove colonial elements and influences in higher education with a focus on addressing past and continuing injustices and prejudices. I particularly like this way of putting it because it captures the practical significance of decoloniality to the extent that it moves beyond the theoretical into the social. I should say that the distinctions that I've offered between these concepts do not in any way reflect the complexity and nuance that they entail. And so I offer them as a way to stimulate your interest so you could possibly do further research around them. I think at UCL, we have some researchers who are specialists on this topic. One of them is Professor Jezreel Tariq, who is actually a member of the working group that designed this project. So you could Google him and then find some of his work on post-colonial theory. So I thought I should also establish the reason why it is important to discuss decolonization in relation to the university. Discussions of decolonization in universities is not just an abstraction, okay, but it has links to the role universities played in colonization. And so if you look at the scholarship on the topic, you find that colonial intellectuals in universities are said to have created justification for colonialism, particularly through the theories they developed on racial hierarchies. Also, universities developed the tools with which colonialists explored and then also mapped colonial territories. And then lastly, many universities benefited from colonial exploitation by way of funds they received from colonial plunders. And so this highlights and puts into the right perspective why decolonization is important in the context of the university. Then in terms of why we should decolonize research, I think many universities, just like UCL, pride themselves as global institutions. And so to that extent, they direct their research to addressing global problems. And so the argument we are making is that for research to be able to address global problems, it needs to reflect the diverse social, cultural, and historical experiences of different groups, including communities and groups that have faced marginalization based on race, ethnicity, gender, class, or sexuality. Additionally, it goes without saying that research in higher education has a direct connection with knowledge production. And so with that comes the power of social classification or social categorization. And again, with that comes the power to label, to name. And if it is not properly done, if it doesn't reflect the perspectives of those in the margins of society, then it is likely to condemn them to subordination. And so based on the preceding, the goal of decolonizing research is to address the hegemonic elements in traditional research methodologies that contribute to domination and subordination in society. I thought I should also address how decolonizing could play out in the research cycle. I think in conventional research, the closest that researchers often come to using decolonizing approaches is when they use participatory approaches. And that is often at the data collection stage of research. But then within a decolonizing framework, we are saying that participatory approaches should be used from the very beginning of the research process, right from the research conceptualization to the formulation of research questions, to the data collection, the writing up, and then the dissemination of findings using participant-led approaches. And I thought I should also outline a few questions that could guide how the research cycle could be decolonized in terms of questions around who has ownership over the research, who initiates the research issues, whose interests do research projects serve, and then who is your research for, who has control over the research, and how are you negotiating power relations and decisions during a research project implementation, as well as what counts as knowledge in research. And then also, more importantly, who has power over publication outputs in the research process. I now want to address the themes that came out of the project. And I should say that if you look at the report we produced, there are many more themes, okay? But for the purpose of today's presentation, I pick a few to highlight the challenges and then the opportunities that exist for decolonizing research. So one has to do with academic leadership, and then there is equitable participation in research, co-production research, intersectionality in research, and then giving visibility to scholarly works of researchers from minoritized background. And then also I'm looking at the relationship between decolonization and then EDI. In terms of academic leadership, I look at that in terms of creating leadership of universities, creating spaces and the enabling environment, as well as the opportunities for dialogues and projects on decolonization. And I also thought that I should cite a recently published work that was done across 9 universities in the UK. And that shows that universities often respond to works of decolonization with some amount of resistance. I think the paper categorizes the way universities respond in 3 ways. Okay, so the first is strategic rejection. The second is reluctant acceptance. And the third is a strategic advancement. And so I'll be looking at leadership at UCL within this framework. So at UCL, the research we conducted showed that there's an open and liberal research culture which facilitates interest and discussions on decolonizing research among researchers. Okay, and this was linked to the activities of focal research centers at UCL. Okay, so at the time, the participants we interviewed made reference to numerous events which were going on at UCL that bordered on decolonization. And specifically, they made mention of the Sarah Parker Raymond Center for the Study of Race. Okay, and they indicated that it provides the forum where researchers go to meet to present their findings on topics related to decolonization and to discuss this with colleagues. Another enabling factor at UCL that was cited by the researchers we interviewed was the availability of seed funding for decolonizing research projects. Some examples were mentioned, the Research Cultures Funding Award, and then also the Grand Challenges funding. I should say that the project I'm reporting on right now, the funding came from Grand Challenges. And then after the publication or after the report of the project was published, Grand Challenges has continued to fund smaller research projects that are taking forward themes from the report we reproduced. And so I think for the past 2 years, they funded these research projects. And then also they've extended the focus just from decolonizing research to look at decolonizing and then climate change. And then besides that, I think they provided some funds for the UCL Medical School to take forward some of the themes from the report in respect of doing some CPD capacity development for staff on the topic of decolonization. Like I mentioned earlier, we did some engagement with EDI committees across UCL, and the report was well received. And the committees expressed interest in incorporating some of the issues we mentioned in the report in their activities. However, a key challenge we faced at the time was getting audience for the report at the upper echelons of power in respect of the academic board. I think we didn't get audience in respect of presenting findings to them and looking at how they could also take forward themes from the report. As to the reasons why this was so, I would want to allude to some perspectives participants shared when we engaged them in the interviews, okay? So some participants felt that UCL's status as a Western and as a global university is somewhat inconsistent or is somewhat contradictory to the agenda of decolonization. Because as a global university, it serves certain agendas, it serves certain interests. And so they went ahead to give examples by asking the question how UCL can decolonize its research if it pursues international research funding and then also participates in university rankings and activities like the research excellence framework, which are based on exploitative and then extractive research models. Okay, so still on the theme of academic leadership, I thought I should provide examples of some good practice in the UK. The first is SOAS, which initiated a decolonizing research initiative. That was in 2019. And the aim was to explore ways in which it can decolonize its research structures, norms, and practices. And as part of that process, it organized an event which brought together researchers, funders, and research directors from across the world to share perspectives and then to also share best practices on decolonizing research. And the outcome of that process was that it put decolonizing research high on the agenda of SOAS, leading to its incorporation into the institution's research strategy. Besides that, they also developed an online training course on ethical reflexivity and research governance. A second example I cite is from London South Bank University, and they appointed a decolonizing research fellow whose role sits firmly within the academic framework of the institution. And I think she works closely with the Pro-Vice Chancellor on Education and Student Experience. And then as part of her work, she works across all schools to deliver their strategy on decolonizing alongside embedding decolonizing in their institutional processes. And then she also works with teaching quality enhancement, the EDI, and then access and participation program. And so these are just examples to show what other universities are doing in respect of embedding decolonizing within their institutional operations and then teaching and then research. So I come to another theme, which is the relationship between decolonization and then EDI. EDI here stands for equality, diversity, and inclusion. Now, some of the participants we engaged with during our interviews were faculty EDI coordinators. And so the views they shared pointed to the fact that the work they do in the committees was expansive or is expansive in nature, to the extent that it is intersectional in approach and then on the themes it covers, usually cutting across the spectrum of gender, race, disability, class, and then sexuality. And so when we asked for their understanding and interpretation of decolonization, much of what they offered reflected the spectrum of intersectionality. But then when we engaged with other researchers from across UCL, they felt that decolonization is different from EDI because the normative goals of decolonization usually has a specific attention to issues of power and knowledge production that goes beyond the inclusion norm that usually characterizes EDI work in universities in the UK. Okay, so moving on again to another theme. Now with this, besides the themes we carved out of discussions or the interviews we had with researchers, they also provided us with case studies, or they provided us with examples of research projects they were undertaking which reflect a decolonizing approach. And so one of the themes we saw reflecting in the projects that is shared was the fact that they aimed at giving visibility to scholarly work undertaken by researchers from minority social backgrounds. Okay, so one of the units within UCL we engaged with was the library services. Actually, we had 4 participants coming from the library services. And they shared with us a project they were undertaking on liberating the collection. And the aim of the project was to address concerns about the lack of representation of diverse voices within the library's collection. And so to achieve this, they did not only make a public commitment to deal with inherent historical biases and inequalities in the library collections, but then they went on to take concrete actions in terms of reviewing all collection policies to ensure diversity in newly acquired materials. Beyond that, they used uncatalogued materials to try to redress balance in the lack of representation in the library's collection. And I thought this was a good example of how to address the issue of the dominance of scholarship of white males. That is often to the neglect of gendered and racialized researchers, work done by gendered and racialized researchers. Another theme we saw in the projects that researchers shared was on equitable participation in research projects. Okay, so basically, the problematic here is that people from minority backgrounds are found not to usually participate in research as high as those from majority backgrounds or white backgrounds. And so a researcher from the UCL Institute of Epidemiology and Healthcare shared a project with us. And the aim of the project was to improve the engagement of ethnic minority communities in health research beyond the methods traditionally used in academia. And she used a particularly novel approach using photography where participants who were based in communities across London, they were invited to creatively express themselves and tell their own stories of health, illness, inequality, or barriers to participation. And then I give a third case study again. Now, this was an international research project undertaken by the UCL Faculty of Built Environment. And the project is known as Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality. And again, in my assessment, international partnerships or international research partnerships are known to be characterized by power imbalances. That is, partnerships between universities based in the global north and those based in the south are often known to be characterized by power imbalances, okay? Because funds usually come from the north, and so that gives them the power to make the decisions around projects implementation and determine theoretical frameworks and approaches to be used in such projects. But for this particular project, they used an approach that was empowering. Okay, so my interest in this project was the fact that they used a concept they called partnerships with equivalence. Okay, so essentially what that means is that the partnership that they enacted between themselves and then the institutions they were working with, which were based in the global south, were equivalent in terms of how power was distributed and in terms of how decisions were made for the project. And again, I thought this was a good way of decolonizing research partnerships. I now look at the challenges for decolonizing research within UCL in specific terms. And this came from the interviews we did with researchers, but also with doctoral students across UCL. One is that ethical framework for research in some faculties were said to still bear colonial dimensions. Okay, so what this means is that research frameworks or ethical frameworks for research usually reflect Eurocentric values, okay, to the neglect of the cultural values of societies based in the global south. And so usually, if PhD students, for example, go to conduct data collection with such frameworks, they encounter problems because of the cultural differences. Another challenge has to do with the fact that the doctoral students we interviewed claimed that they had limited support in terms of using decolonizing frameworks in their research. Okay, and that was linked to the fact that some of the supervisors, even though were interested and would encourage them to use decolonizing framework, appear not to have the capacity to support them in that respect. And so they had to do their own reading, they had to do their own collaborations in order to build knowledge and expertise on decolonizing frameworks. A third challenge for decolonizing research that came up had to do with the operations of research centers at UCL, whose focus are on the global south. Okay, so the indication we had was that support for these research centers are limited in respect of teaching and then also research. And when I talk about global south, I'm talking about Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the like. And then in terms of research project management, another challenge that came up strongly was the fact that there were some institutional bureaucracies and bottlenecks in the management of research projects, which made it difficult for researchers to collaborate in decolonizing with partners based in the global south. And this had to do particularly with the due diligence requirements for research projects. Okay, some of these were said not to reflect the challenging circumstances in the context of universities based in the global south. And then lastly, certain terms of engagement for researchers at UCL do not enable them to support decolonizing research with partners based in the global south, okay? So for example, some stated that UCL will often require that in order to get time out of teaching to conduct research, the funds of a research project would have to be managed by UCL. And so they could not support projects whose funds did not pass through UCL. And that made it difficult for them to kind of apply decolonizing approaches in respect of allowing institutions in the global south to manage research funds. Finally, I would want to look at the recommendations from the report. Like I mentioned from the external examples I cited, we recommended that UCL should incorporate decolonization themes in its education strategy. And then it should also provide more support to research centers whose work focus on the global south. And then also in terms of the support to doctoral education, especially for students coming from underrepresented groups, we felt that there should be scrutiny of the structures and incentives UCL puts in place for that. And then lastly, the Arena Center should provide appropriate training for all UCL staff on decolonizing themes. That brings my presentation to a close. But I should also state that the themes I presented are just a few of many from the report. And so if you're interested in the fuller discussions, it would be nice to get a report yourself. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Really lots of interesting, important things from that piece of research. What Simon has summarized is the sort of context about the importance of decoloniality in relationship to research and higher education. He's giving some summaries of some of the key terminology and questions around it. He's also shown some points about its relevance, importance within higher education, how it relates to how knowledge is constructed and how higher education is organized and developed in partnerships with universities around the world. He's then talked about some of the examples of themes from the research that he conducted and some of the challenges he found, but also in relation to some of the examples of some of the projects that the Grand Challenges team has supported. So thank you very much, Simon. Lots of very rich and very important questions and points that you've raised. Okay, so there've been a number of questions already in Slido, and I think there's 4 at the moment. So what I'll do is I'll take each one in turn, Simon, and then ask you to respond. Is that okay? Yeah. So first one is how can universities work with communities outside of academia to decolonize knowledge production and ensure the research is relevant and beneficial to those communities?
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, so I think for universities to be able to work with communities outside the university, I think there are certain models of decolonizing research they need to use. And like I highlighted in one of the slides I presented, there are certain key questions you should be able to ask when working with communities in the area of research. I'm just trying to find a slide. Yes.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yes. So you're asking questions around whether or not you see communities having any ownership of the research problems you are going in. Then also you are looking at questions as to whether the research issues were identified by you as a researcher or communities have a stake in those issues. And then also, what interest is the research serving? Okay, so I think these questions are very essential when you are working with communities in the area of research. I think the important thing is to, number one, recognize the agency of communities, okay? They are carriers of knowledge, wealth of knowledge, okay? And so if you go having that in mind, then you are able to dig into that wealth of knowledge to enrich the process. Now, one of the themes that came up strongly in our research, in our interviews, and that also reflected in the case studies researchers provided, had to do with the theme on co-production. Okay, now that looks at the extent to which the researcher and then the researched collaborate all through the research process. Okay, and so if you adopt the tenets and then the values of co-production in working with communities, I think that would qualify as decolonizing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Another question is how can higher education institutions respect and use knowledge from other cultures or minorities without appropriating them and using them in the wrong way?
Again, I think this comes back to the question of agency. Now, if you allow communities, if you allow groups to speak for themselves, and if you allow that to reflect in the research process, and if you allow that to reflect in the research outputs, then you are more likely to address the problem of appropriation.
Okay, thank you. Were the goals of decoloniality and EDI at odds in practical terms? Do you think that EDI and decoloniality fit well together? This is the equality and diversity and inclusion areas that Simon referred to in his research.
Yeah, so I think generally speaking, we could say they serve similar goals in terms of addressing issues of social injustice. But in specific terms, I think EDI, it is often undertaken in universities in the UK, uses or focuses on an inclusion norm. Okay, but then if you look at decolonization and decoloniality, it centers on power. Okay, it centers on the distribution of power. It centers on knowledge production. Okay, and that is where the difference is. And for me, I'm of the view that I think there can be some collaboration between the two fields. Okay, in other words, I see the possibility of EDI workers incorporating values and ideas from decolonization. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for that, Simon. I would possibly add from that, from my involvement with you on this, is that there's also a danger that by just putting decoloniality in EDI, you can then ignore some of the broader questions about funding and about curriculum development and knowledge development. So yeah, I think that's one of the things we've always been quite conscious of, but it's an important area, and certainly our experience so far with this project has been that there's been a lot of engagement with EDI committees across UCL. Thank you. There's a number of very positive comments, Simon, about what you've said, about very much enjoyed your presentation. One comment was, I was wondering if there's interest in creating a course for PhD students on how to carry out decolonized research.
Yes, at UCL, actually, one of the case studies that we were furnished with from the Faculty of Built Environment, there's a researcher there who has developed a framework for incorporating EDI in postgraduate research. It doesn't have a specific focus on decoloniality, but I see the possibility of it addressing some of the concerns of decolonization.
You had some conversations with some of the doctoral school or some of the people running courses for doctoral students, didn't you, in terms of your research? Did that come up?
Yes. So the doctoral school, I think, is in the process of developing an EDI model, okay, for doctoral training. And I think at the time, the challenge was that it was slated to be only for 1 hour. And our concern was that that was too short for comprehensive training. Yeah, but I think I've not had any feedback, I mean, any response from them in terms of how they have progressed with the development of that EDI model.
Okay. So there's the challenge we're posing is really the need for a course for doctoral students rather than just a one-off session. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And are you aware, aware that any students have raised these questions with you about what they would value this? Do you know if there's much demand from students, doctoral students?
Yes. In our interviews with doctoral students, many PhD students found the concept of decolonizing very interesting, especially for those from the science background. Okay, so for example, I had a physics PhD student telling me that he finds the concept very interesting, but he lacks the knowledge, the skill to be able to use it in his PhD work. And also that is because most of the discussion that goes on decolonization happens within the disciplinary fields of the humanities and then the social sciences.
Yeah.
And so in those fields, there is material available. Okay, so students could easily access them and then develop their capacity. But if you look into the sciences, there is very few materials available in that respect. So I think that is one of the challenges.
Sure. But you did have some interviews with people from some of those sciences, didn't you, for some of the research?
Yes.
And there was some interest, but it's a question, I presume, of getting it more broadly. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. I think in our EDI engagements, yes, some researchers from science disciplinary background express interest in being able to use the framework in their work. Yeah. And I think that even calls for cross-faculty engagement. I think it is possible for researchers from the science background to learn from those in the humanities and in the social sciences. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
And I should mention that within the Faculty of Maths and Physical Sciences, okay, the STS department has a particularly high interest,
Ah,
and they carry a wealth of knowledge on the topic of decolonization. And so any researcher who has that interest could contact them in that regard.
okay. Thank you. Thank you. Um, there's a question about, are there any tips for trying to get decolonial work off the ground, but meeting resistance from budget holders and departmental leads?
Well, I think it's one of the issues I addressed in my presentation, because if there is no institutional buy-in, then you are likely to have some resistance from time to time. Yeah, but I think again, we can always learn from universities that have progressed this agenda right from the bottom up. Yeah, especially from SOAS and then London South Bank University, like I mentioned in my presentation.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, and I think some of the issues often arise because of the questions about funding and questions about partnership funding and so on. But yeah, yes, but also I think to say that if people are having those problems, to to contact yourself, Simon, on myself, and say in which if there are areas that we could look at, and we can raise that more widely within the university, because what is important about Simon's research, it was sponsored by the Grand Challengers, and that has broader university institutional buy-in. So I think that's quite important to note that. So um, Simon's research is just not something on the margins of the work university. It's been recognised and supported across the university. Okay, there's a question about can you expand on partnerships of equivalence? There can be institutional resource gaps. So talk about where what you see from your experience, or what you see is important about institutional partnerships, and how you engage, how you ensure that there's some form of equitable partnerships with universities in the global south in terms of your research. So this was quite a major thing I know that came out of research, and something I can say a bit more about in a moment because there's been some follow-up work on that. But I wondered if there's something that you wanted to say from your experience, but also from the people that you interviewed, what were any of them saying any of those sorts of questions or themes?
Yes, so international partnerships in research generally have that problem, okay? And I think from my engagement with those I interviewed, there was a sense in which that is a limitation, because often when you look into international research partnerships, one of the aims is to build capacity. Okay, but often if funds, the management of funds are left in the hands of institutions based in the global north, that usually affects the power dynamics. Okay, so for example, I was engaging with one researcher, and I used the word capacity development, and then she protested. Okay, because she felt that researchers based in the global south in themselves have the capacity. Okay, and so it is not the role of academics based in the global north to build, but then there's the important role of facilitating, okay, the process. And so I think that there needs to be a shift in the way international partnerships are managed between universities in the global north and those based in the south. Yeah, but I think funding is a huge determinant in terms of the directions in which these partnerships take.
Yeah, and we from my work in chairing the Grand Challenge and Cultural Understanding that's led on this work, and we've been looking at this area more recently, and we've been recently working with the British Academy to undertaking going to undertake some research about how we address some of these questions, because some of these issues we know are institutional, but also there's sort of practical funding questions that are often been raised, and universities often have funding policies that make some of these equitable partnerships difficult. Did you find anything from your research, Simon, where you found an example of a really good partnership, equitable partnership that could easily be used? Well, not could easily be used, but is a way of possibly encouraging others to look at. Did you find anything?
Yes, again, it goes back to the funding model. So I had a specific case where a researcher felt that most funding agencies or most funding organizations in the UK prefer that funds are managed by universities based in the global north. But then the researcher also cited an exception, which is the Wellcome Trust. Okay, and I think in the Wellcome Trust, the model they use, they encourage funds to be managed by universities based in the global south. And I thought that that was a very good example in terms of how to even decolonize the management of international research projects.
Okay, great. Okay, so that might be something to encourage people to look at. Okay, we have two last sort of questions to ask. What this is the really big one. If you want universities to really change, not just talk about it, what are the top things they can start doing right away? What's the things they can really look at first of all that can start to make a difference, that could well engage others? Where would you start?
I think that there is value in using a bottom-up approach, but I also see significance in the sorts of decisions that go into the management of universities and the kind of representations we have at that level. Okay, I think one of the researchers I interviewed pointed to the fact that a key question that needed to be asked is who are making decisions on these issues, and that has a bearing on how these issues can be progressed or advanced. So for me, policy is important. Yeah, decision making is important, and then also a reflection of diverse representation is also key.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the last question we've got is that are you aware from any specific research centres at UCL whose work focuses on Global South countries or in partnership with the Global South that you can see as good examples that people could look at?
I mentioned the Sarah Parker Remond Center for the Study of Race, but also I know there are centers that deal with topics on regional studies. I think I remember citing one that has a focus on Asia. I'm Asia and the Middle East. And I think Professor Tariq has something to do with that research center. And I feel that those are some good examples.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, across the university, there are a wealth of research centers and research that covers some of the questions that you're raising. I just want to say from a personal side to bring some of these things to conclusion, and is that, you know, what have you learned personally from this process of the research? What have you found out that have felt that challenge you, that you found out was different to what you expected, and bearing in mind your own PhD research and how that compared with what you found at UCL? What have you taken from that research for your own work and future work as an academic and researcher?
One particular important element that I found interesting, but also that confounded me was I don't know how to put this well, but usually a tendency for discussions around decoloniality to take on dimensions of ethnic divisions, racial divisions. Yeah, but in my engagement with academics, I found researchers from majority ethnic background who were very supportive. Okay. And what I'm learning, or what I learned from that, is that for us to be able to advance the cause of decolonization, the process has to be collaborative. Okay. I think in the scholarship, they call them allies.
Sure.
Yeah. So that sprung up strongly to me when I was doing the interviews.
Okay.
Yeah, especially in terms of the numbers that responded and the sorts of ideas they shared.
Okay. Great. Great. Thank you, Simon. That's great. So thank you for answering all those questions. There were quite a lot of them, and some quite interesting ones, and also some quite challenging ones. So just want to finally to say thanks for Simon for an excellent presentation on a topic that's becoming increasingly important to the work of UCL, and obviously is becoming a feature of many universities' practice in this country and elsewhere in the world. And no doubt we'll be returning to this theme through a number of voices and places across UCL in the months and years to come. So thanks very much, Simon. So just want to say to thank everyone for coming today, for enjoying, hoping you all enjoy this lunch hour lecture, and to let you know that our next lunch hour lecture is on the 4th of March, is on social prescribing, groundbreaking or gimmickry. Okay, so we all look forward to that, and thanks everyone for coming, and thanks again, Simon, for your excellent presentation, and see everyone again soon. Thank you very much.